The newspaper headline slipped under Frank's door was stark and simple: Vegas dancer found dead in Lake Mead. But Dolores Martinez had been breathing just 12 hours back, sitting right there in his private booth and spilling casino secrets that could blow up half of Las Vegas. The phone started ringing before Frank could wrap his head around what he was reading. "She knew way too much about your Vegas deals, Francis." The voice was calm, almost nice about it. "Make sure you don't pull the same bonehead move." Click. Just like that, Frank's staring at this headline and it hits him. Somebody just declared war by taking out his best source. Dolores wasn't just another showgirl chasing the Hollywood dream and falling for the wrong guys. For a year and a half, she'd been Frank's eyes and ears on the inside, this gorgeous brunette who could remember everything and sweet-talk secrets right out of casino big shots. She'd hang around those VIP lounges across the strip listening to everything. But what really got Frank's hands shaking after that phone call wasn't just hearing she was dead. It was knowing somebody had figured out their little setup and decided to send him a message he couldn't ignore. The Desert Rose Review at the Flamingo had been Dolores's cover story, a real job that put her face to face with high rollers, casino managers, and the kind of guys who cut deals in dark corners and sealed them with handshakes that could get you killed if you broke them. She was 24, had this coal black hair and green eyes that could make any guy forget he had secrets worth keeping. But Frank didn't recruit her for her looks. Hell, Vegas was crawling with beautiful dames. He wanted her because she was sharp and hungry for something bigger than dancing for drunk tourists and aging wise guys. Their whole arrangement started by accident back in late '57. Frank caught Dolores having it out with her boyfriend outside the Copa room after one of his shows. The boyfriend, some small-time bookie named Eddie Torino, was trying to muscle her into pumping information out of the casino executive she danced for. Frank stepped in, not because he was being a gentleman, but because he smelled opportunity. If Dolores was gonna be digging up dirt anyway, Frank figured might as well work for somebody who could appreciate her talents and pay her right. "You want to know what really goes on in this town?" Frank had asked her that first night, sitting in his private booth while the Copa room emptied out around them. "I can show you how to turn what you hear into real power. But this ain't no game, sweetheart. In Vegas, what you know can be the most dangerous thing you're carrying." Dolores turned out to be worth every dime Frank paid her. Through her connections at the Flamingo, she gave him the heads up about hostile takeover tries at the Sands, the real story on rival casinos going broke, and most important, intelligence about how the East Coast families who ran Vegas's underground were shifting around. Frank used her tips to stay ahead of his enemies, make smart investments, and position himself as the guy the right people needed when they needed him. But information networks, Frank had learned over the years, were like those spider webs, delicate as hell and easy to wreck if somebody yanked the wrong thread. Dolores getting killed meant he'd lost his best asset, but worse than that, somebody knew enough about his operations to target her specifically. What kept Frank awake for the next 3 nights wasn't wondering who killed her. In Vegas, beautiful women died for all kinds of reasons, usually involving men, money, or both. What he couldn't figure out was who else knew about their deal and what they planned to do with that information. The funeral was on a Friday afternoon at some little Catholic church way out on the edge of town, far from all the neon and razzmatazz of the Strip. Frank showed up, sat in the back row, and watched Dolores's family, this tired-looking mother, 2 younger sisters, and an older brother who worked construction, say goodbye to a daughter they barely knew since she'd left their small Colorado town to chase her dreams in Nevada. Frank had flowers sent anonymously and paid for the whole thing through a third party, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was just as responsible for her being dead as whoever actually did the job. Detective Ray Morrison from Vegas Metro got assigned to investigate Dolores's death, but Frank knew Morrison was one of several local cops who made extra cash by looking the other way when certain kinds of business needed privacy. The official report would call Dolores's death an accidental drowning, probably after some late-night party that got out of hand. There wouldn't be any mention of what she really did for a living, no digging into her personal relationships, and sure as hell no questions about whether she might have been killed for what she knew instead of what she owed or who she'd crossed. Frank started his own investigation the day after the funeral. Using contacts he'd built up over 15 years in Las Vegas, he began asking careful questions about Dolores's last few days. What he found out painted a picture of a young woman who'd been getting more and more nervous in the weeks before she died, showing up late for her gigs at the Flamingo, asking other showgirls about the best ways to blow town fast and quiet. The big break came from somebody Frank never saw coming, Mickey Torino, Eddie's kid brother, who dealt cards at the Desert Inn and made side money selling information to anybody willing to pay. Mickey sidled up to Frank at the Sands bar on a Thursday night, sliding into the booth next to him with that jumpy energy guys get when they know they're rolling the dice on something dangerous. "You want the real story about what happened to Dolores Martinez?" Mickey's voice barely carried over the noise of slot machines and chatter. "Because I know who she was really working for, and it wasn't just you." Frank felt his blood go cold. "What the hell are you talking about, Mickey?" "She was playing both sides. Mr. Sinatra had been for months. Whatever information she was feeding you, she was also passing along to Tommy Castellano's crew at the Tropicana. They were paying her twice what you were, and they wanted everything she could dig up about your operations at the Sands. Tommy Castellano was Chicago's man in Las Vegas, and his relationship with Frank had always been complicated. Sometimes they were buddies, sometimes they were competing for the same action, but they always kept things looking friendly because personal feuds could turn into shooting wars real fast in a town where everybody was packing heat. "There's more," Mickey kept going, looking around like he expected somebody to be listening in. "Word is Dolores got greedy. Started demanding more dough from both sides, threatening to spill everything if she didn't get what she wanted. That's when things went south real quick." Frank felt that familiar weight settling in his chest, the feeling you get when you realize you've been played and there's nothing you can do about it. In Las Vegas, greed was like cancer, and Dolores had apparently caught a terminal case. But what bothered Frank more than her double-crossing him was realizing he'd completely underestimated her. He'd seen her as just a useful tool, somebody he could control, but she'd been playing a much more dangerous game than he'd figured. "Who gave the order?" Frank asked, keeping his voice low. Mickey shook his head. "That's the thing. Nobody's sure. Could have been Tommy's people cleaning up a mess before it got out of hand. Could have been somebody from your crew who found out about the double dealing and decided to handle it permanent-like. Hell, could have been Dolores's ex-boyfriend Eddie looking for payback after she dumped him. In this town, there's always more guys who could have done it than ways to prove it." Frank understood how murder worked in Las Vegas. Too many people with too many reasons and never enough evidence pointing in just one direction. The cops wouldn't look too hard, the newspapers would run a small story about some tragic accident, and inside a week everybody except her family and the guys who'd used her would forget Dolores Martinez ever existed. But Frank couldn't let it slide. Not because he'd loved Dolores, their whole thing had been strictly business, whatever feelings there were carefully kept in check. He couldn't let it go because her death meant his information network had failed big time, and because somebody out there knew enough about his operations to have set up her elimination. The answer came to him 3 weeks later in an envelope that got slipped under his dressing room door at the Sands during his midnight show. Inside was just one photograph. Dolores and Frank sitting together in his private booth at the Copa Room, deep in conversation, taken with some kind of long-distance camera from across the casino floor. On the back, somebody had written, "We know everything," in block letters that looked like they were trying to hide their handwriting. Frank stared at that photograph for a long time, finally understanding that Dolores's death hadn't been about greed or double-crossing or even the information she'd been selling. It had been about him. Somebody had killed her to send him a message. His network was blown, his operations were being watched, and his enemies were a lot closer than he'd thought. He should have been scared, but instead Frank felt something like relief. For 18 months he'd been operating blind, never knowing which secrets were safe and which were getting sold to the highest bidder. Now at least he knew he was being watched, and by somebody smart enough to have identified and eliminated his best asset without leaving any evidence that could point back to them. Frank burned the photograph in the ashtray on his dressing table, watching Dolores's face curl up and turn black in the flames. Then he made a bunch of phone calls, reaching out to contacts in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, asking careful questions and calling in favors he'd been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. What he learned over the next week confirmed his worst fears. Somebody had been systematically mapping his Vegas operations for months, identifying his sources, documenting his methods, and putting together what looked like a complete file on everything from his casino investments to his personal relationships. Dolores had been just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, and her death had been designed not just to eliminate a security risk but to show him how completely his organization had been penetrated. He never did figure out who his enemy was, but Frank started suspecting it was somebody inside his own circle, somebody with access to information that should have been known only to his most trusted people. The paranoia that followed was almost unbearable, turning every conversation into a potential interrogation and every gesture into a possible signal to watchers he couldn't see. Frank's response was typical Frank, methodical and thorough. He started systematically tearing down the intelligence network he'd built, cutting ties with sources, changing how he did business, and moving his most sensitive activities to places where he could control who got in and who didn't. It cost him a fortune and took forever, but it was the only way to make sure what happened to Dolores wouldn't happen to anybody else working for him. The whole process took 6 months, and when it was finished, Frank found himself operating blind in a city where information was the difference between making it big and ending up face down in the desert. But he'd learned a valuable lesson about the price of playing spy games in a town where everybody was watching everybody else and where loyalty was always for sale to whoever had the most cash. Dolores Martinez never made it into any of the official histories of Las Vegas, and her death only got a tiny mention in the local paper. But for Frank Sinatra, her memory became a constant reminder of the dangers lurking underneath his glittering empire. Every time he took the stage at the Sands, every time he cut a business deal or made a new alliance, he carried with him the knowledge that in Las Vegas, trust was a luxury that could get you killed. The showgirl's death had taught him that in a city built on secrets, the most dangerous secret of all was thinking you knew who your real friends were. Frank had survived by learning to trust nobody completely and to figure that every conversation was being recorded, every relationship was being monitored, and every alliance was just temporary. But Frank's education in the darker arts of Vegas survival wasn't over yet. 2 months after he'd finished tearing down his intelligence network, another envelope showed up under his dressing room door. This time it had just a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, with a phone number written in red ink across the face. When Frank called the number from a payphone way outside the city limits, that same calm voice that had told him about Dolores's death spoke just 4 words: "You learned your lesson." The caller never said who he was, but Frank got the message loud and clear. Dolores had been a test, a demonstration of power designed to show him how vulnerable his operations really were. Somebody had spent months studying his methods, identifying his weak spots, and then eliminated his most valuable asset just to prove they could do it. It was a chess move that took real guts, and Frank found himself grudgingly admiring the cold precision of whoever had pulled it off. Years later, Frank would wonder if Dolores had known how dangerous her double life had gotten. Had she picked up on the signs that her value as an intelligence asset was outweighed by her risk as a security problem? Did she understand in those final weeks, when she'd gotten increasingly jumpy and distracted, that she was being watched by people who operated on a level way above the petty casino politics she thought she understood? The official story of Dolores Martinez stayed the same: a tragic accident, a young woman who drowned after a night of drinking and bad choices. But Frank carried the real truth with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that in Las Vegas, even the most beautiful and talented people were ultimately expendable if they knew too much or wanted too much, or just happened to be standing in the wrong place when powerful men decided to send messages to each other. In the end, Dolores Martinez had given Frank Sinatra the most valuable piece of intelligence of his career, understanding that in Las Vegas being paranoid wasn't a mental problem, it was how you stayed alive. And sometimes the price of survival wasn't measured in money or power, but in the lives of people who trusted you to keep them safe in a world where safety was just another thing to be bought and sold. If this tragic story of betrayal and survival in the golden age of Vegas moved you, show your appreciation with a like, because some secrets come with a deadly price. What do you think, was Frank responsible for Dolores's death, or was she a victim of the dangerous game she chose to play? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the dark side of Las Vegas, where information was power and power could kill.